I want to thank everyone here and abroad for attending today. I am very proud to be chair of the board of Global Citizen Circle, organization that was started a couple years actually before I was born, but the legacy continues. This organization is about leading and not following. And I greet you today in the words of a famous Bostonian, Frederick Douglass. And he said that we are one, our cause is one, and we must work together if we are to succeed. George Floyd's life matters. Eric Garner's life matters. Breonna Taylor's life matters. Michael Brown's life matters. Sandra Bland's life matters. Dante Wright's life matters. Andrew Kearse's life matters. And in addition, we also must pay homage to Micaiah Bryant, a 15-year-old in Columbus, Ohio, who 30 minutes before the verdict was read, was shot 4 times by Columbus police officers, fatally shot. So the work that we are doing must be defined, or what happened yesterday must be defined as accountability, and it can't be defined as justice just yet, because that would mean we would have redemption. And it is a real question as to why Black men and Black women have to die for there to be accountability. And so one phrase that I heard yesterday that really jumped out at me with with Keith Ellis, who was speaking, he spoke of the bouquet of humanity that stepped forward and turned their cameras on, stepped forward and challenged the police officers, stepped forward and just held a presence there. And so I would submit to you that we are at a time where we must press our advantage, and that the world is looking at us as the United States and all of the countries that are represented here. History will judge us based on what we do or what we don't do. History will judge us on speaking up or on our silence. And so I will leave you with one more quote, and then I'll introduce 2 of the amazing panelists. And I'll leave you with a quote that's from the Jewish tradition in the Talmud. And this quote is made famous by a rabbi named Rabbi Tarfon. And he says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." So I thank you for continuing to walk with us as we do this work. And that walk today is going to be led by a friend, my big brother, who actually weighs a lot less than me, but very good friend, international advocate, and known for the space, Akila Sherrills. He's going to be the moderator. He's the director of the Newark Community Street Team, a community-based violence reduction initiative, a former Grape Street Crip. He was one of the primary architects of the famous Bloods and Crip truce in 1992. An amazing, amazing brother, and someone who continues to lead in this space. And I love you, brother, and I want to thank you for the work that you've done in going back, elevating, and being an example for what individuals can be, and also an example that shows we can't throw folk away. The people who are going to change and transform us are among us. And I thank you for that. Susan Lay, program manager at UTEC, nationally recognized as a model agency serving justice involved young adults. UTEC's policy platform includes legislative initiatives ranging from youth violence prevention to youth justice reform. This sister is awesome, fantastic, and amazing. Young sister who's out here doing the work on a day-to-day basis, interrupting violence, holding elected officials accountable. Actually have led initiative in Lowell to lower the age of voting, so young people could actually vote on municipal issues. And just an awesome, fantastic, and amazing sister. So happy to have you here. And I'm gonna turn it over to my brother from another mother. He favors mom a little bit. I'm gonna turn it over to Martin O'Brien.
Thanks very much, Tito, and it's great to be here with everybody today and on this particular day. The issue of kind of transforming policing is, not unique to one place, and obviously different places differ in the challenges which they face. But in developing this conversation today, Social Change Initiative and Global Citizen Circle felt that it would be helpful to kind of draw on the lessons and experience and learning of two other places that have grappled with the issue of how to secure an effective, fair, human rights respecting, diverse, accountable, legitimate police service, and those issues of policing and community safety. And so we didn't have to look too far in that here in Northern Ireland, where we're based, we've had our own very deep and profound challenges with policing. And then we've also had a long partnership and friendship with colleagues in South Africa who have also had to deal with those issues. And so I'm delighted to introduce two friends and colleagues who, and mindful of Tito's quote, who haven't abandoned the task. Zelda Holtzman from South Africa has been labouring in the vineyard for a very long time in terms of delivering a fairer South Africa. Zelda was involved in the military structures of the ANC, the underground structures, for many years, and she, after transition in South Africa, she took on a role in trying to transform the apartheid police service, and she herself then went on to become one of the most senior police officers in South Africa. And so I'm delighted that Zelda is here with us. The second colleague is my friend Debbie Waters, who was working for very, very many years in the field of community restorative justice, trying to identify more effective ways to deal with problems that local communities face here in Northern Ireland. Debbie, for many years, was a kind of a bit of a pariah, Debbie, I think you would say. The government was always very hostile to the work that Debbie was doing, and far from supporting it, tried to thwart it at every turn. But Debbie's story is an interesting one because she has, up until quite recently, been the deputy chair of the police authority in Northern Ireland, which had the responsibility for holding policing to account. So we have in Debbie and Zelda two people who've actually worked in these institutions very closely with the institutions of the police. And I suppose both of them have stories of progress made and rollbacks, I guess. So in the context of kind of dedicating ourselves today to doing something about the issue of policing, I think it's very useful to have the perspectives of these two people from other places who've been grappling with this problem, and a difficult problem it is, how to secure enduring change in the way in which police services do their work. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Akila, who's going to lead us forward. And as I say, it's great to see so many people here on this important day. So thank you. Tequila.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you, Tito, for the introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening for wherever you are in the world. Aquila Sherrills, and I'm so honored today to be the discussion leader for this important dialogue about discussing the hard realities of policing reform, building safe and just communities. As Tito said, I grew up in the Jordan Housing Projects in LA. I participated in many social justice activists called the longest running war in the history of this country, of the US. It's urban street gang wars. I lost many friends and family members, including my own son, to violence in the streets. But all of those things, I see as fuel, for this important dialogue and conversation that we have to engage as people, as we begin to redefine public safety in this country. Traditionally, you say public safety and people say police. It was a domain that was owned by law enforcement. And the reality is that police are only one aspect of the public safety process. You literally cannot have public safety without the public, right? Public safety is not just the absence of violence and crime in communities. It's also the presence of well-being in the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey. I woke up this morning, honestly, with a really heavy heart. The verdict yesterday, although, significant and important in terms of, justice for George Floyd's family, it's only a beginning. We have so much, further to go. We're literally at an inflection point in this country in terms of public safety. Never again should law enforcement be considered a single point of contact for safety in our respective community. As I said, law enforcement is only one aspect of the public safety process. We have to develop, and not only do we have to develop, it already exists, complementary strategies to policing that are just haven't been invested in. I've been doing this work for some 30 years. For the past 7 years, I've been working in the city of Newark. I was tapped by the mayor in 2014 to build out his complementary strategy to policing in the city. Newark was a city that was on the top 10 most violent city list for almost 50 consecutive years. But since we've instituted our program, the Newark Community Street Team, we've had now 6 consecutive years in a row of decreases of homicide and overall violence. In 2019, we had a 60-year low. We had 51 murders in the city, which is 51 too many. But even during the pandemic, as violence spiked all across the country, we held that number to 51. And this is because we have a coordinated strategy. We train residents in neighborhoods as public safety professionals. They utilize their relationships to intervene and mediate conflicts to a peaceful outcome. This is extremely important, to understand, because we've been sold this idea, right, that and especially in the Black community, this false narrative, right, around Black on Black crime, as if Black people are responsible for their own safety. In a country where we invest billions of dollars, Black people invest billions of dollars in public safety infrastructure. But it's because of white supremacy and white nationalism that's been embedded in policing. The history of policing in the US grew out of the Fugitive Slave Act, right? And for years, we've struggled, as community members, working with the criminal legal system in which our loved ones are murdered. As I said, I lost my son to the streets. My son's case has been a cold case for 15 years. And maybe because I was Black, maybe because I didn't share law enforcement frame around what justice is, that there was no real investigation, on apprehending the perpetrator, of that violent act against my son and my family, right? But we persist. Again, my son's death is not in vain, because every day I live, is to ensure that his life is valuable, and that those who grow up in these neighborhoods understand that violence is a public health issue. And that if we understand violence as a disease and we're going to work through the public health frame, that we're going to make sure that those who are closest in proximity, to the issue have the resources, the skills, the tools necessary to intervene and to prevent and to treat, this disease that we call violence, right? I want to celebrate, the city of Newark. I want to celebrate, the members of the Newark Community Street Team. I want to celebrate the mayor, Ras J. Baraka, the most progressive mayor in the country, for his stance. Because if you don't have the politics, the people, the paperwork, if you don't have those things all in alignment, it makes it really difficult to be able to shift, the public safety narrative in any respective community, right? And that's our goal. Our goal is to change the public safety narrative in this country and globally, that says that people, in neighborhoods, in communities where they live, have to be engaged in the public safety process. And we have to own it, so that we actually have the ability to create real safety. And so today, I get an opportunity to moderate this conversation with some of the great leaders that was just shared, introduced to you earlier. And so I'll start out by asking the question and presenting it to the group, and we'll have in order, right? Maybe Debbie and then Zelda and then Susan can respond to this question. But the question is, what is the most important lesson you've learned working with police reform and building safe and just communities? And so let's start with you, Debbie.
Okay, thank you, Akila. And like everyone else, can I just say it's a real privilege to be here today. I'm actually think the timing of this is amazing. I know yesterday's verdict is a moment in time, but let's make it a changing moment in time. And if it is the beginning of something new, the journey will continue. I suppose what I want to talk to you about today is the journey of police reform in Northern Ireland, and that can sound really, really dry. And how do you do it in 5 minutes, and how do you bring it to life? But let me start by saying, and I normally don't start on a negative, but let me start by saying we're 20 years into a policing reform programme. And today, as I sit here with you and watching what I watched last night on television, even in our jurisdiction, I'm continually amazed by the lack of emotional and cultural sensitivity shown by our police service. And that's with a reform programme of 20 years. So I suppose, Akila, one of the biggest lessons that I have learned is you can never take your foot off the pedal. And if you do, things will roll backwards. So this is a continual fight for justice. We started our reform programme about 23 years ago. Most of you will know of the Troubles, and we had the signing of the Good Friday Agreement 23 years ago. And policing was always a contested space in this jurisdiction. It was always difficult because the police, there was a perception and a reality that the police belonged to one side of the community, the Protestant side of the community, and not to the Catholic side of the community. In reality, it felt more to me like a class issue. So if you lived in a poor, socially disadvantaged community, you were very disenfranchised, disconnected, and marginalized from the whole public health debate, public safety debate, and the policing debate. And I think that probably resonates with everyone here. It tends to be more of a class issue than anything else. We had a policing reform programme, and some of you may know, and I don't want you to laugh at this, but out of our policing reform programme, we had just a mere 175 recommendations. Oh my God, 175. That's how much reform needed to take place. And I suppose looking back, we should have asked the question, were all of those really necessary? And what are the priority ones that we needed to implement immediately? But let me share with you, I think, the 2 or 3 key aspects of policing reform. And I hope that this, it brings it to life for you. So our policing reform programme, we're still on that journey, but the key thing was all of the reforms were enshrined in legislation. So unless you attach money to it, unless you measure it, unless you enshrine it in legislation, it does not get done. So that is one of the key pieces of learning for us. Secondly, there was political will to make this happen. So there was a party within the Republican community, Sinn Féin, that really pushed this forward. Unless there's political will, unless it's enshrined in legislation, it's not going to happen, folks. So those were the two things that gave us the leverage, that gave us the weight and the teeth to do business. The third thing was, when you talk about policing reform, don't look at it just through the lens of policing. So we changed the whole policing architecture. So the three bodies that now make up the policing architecture are the police service, and we don't use the word force anymore, because the police are there to serve the community. Language is really important. Martin talked about the police authority, which I was on for 10 years and it nearly killed me, folks, but it was worth it. So the policing accountability body that holds the police authority, that holds the police to account, and then the complaints body. So members of the public don't take their complaints to the police. They don't take their complaints to one person, the mayor. They take their complaints to a completely independent body that has no political affiliation whatsoever. So those three bodies made up the policing architecture, the new policing architecture. I think the reform programme of the PSNI was really, really important, because it began the first 10 years, and this is going to sound really long to you. The first 10 years was spent changing procedures and policy. The second 10 years was spent winning hearts and minds and changing culture. So this is not a slow process, or this is not an easy process. It's not a quick fix. It doesn't happen overnight. But when I review the policing architecture, I want to say to you what I think is one of the greatest strengths, and that's the policing authority. Because with it, we were able to push through two frameworks that underpins every aspect of policing: human rights and a policing with the community framework. And every new policy that the PSNI introduce has to go through the policing authority and being seen through the lens of human rights and policing with the community. So one of the questions I routinely asked the police when they went into a community heavy-handed was, tell me, how did you benchmark that against your policing with the community lens? Can I see the audit trail for that? What does that look and feel like? Who did you liaise with in the community? What advice did you take from them, and how did you implement that advice? That is enshrined in law for us. The police have to do that. They have to see things through a human rights lens and through a policing with the community lens. And that has completely transformed policing for us. We don't think we've arrived, but I think if you came and spent a month in Belfast, you would think how we do business is quite amazing. So in the past 20 years, we have an armed police service. Every police officer carries a gun. And in 20 years, one person has been shot dead by the police service. And that one shooting was as a result of an off-duty police officer wrongly deploying their weapon. I think that is actually amazing. So sometimes we don't give our police service the credit, but actually the other bit that I want to highlight, and then I'll keep quiet, our accountability mechanism The Policing as Authority is a 19-member board. Now, that might sound very cumbersome to you and very unwieldy, but actually that's made up of 10 politicians and 9 members of civic society. I was just a community worker appointed to that body, and the influence and the power that that gave me in terms of connecting my community into policing and policing decisions was unbelievable. So you see a mayor overseeing policing and being the accountability body, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work that a political appointee in and of themselves is fulfilling that role. You need civic engagement really at the heart of accountability. And if you don't have that, that means that the policing architecture is not taken seriously, the role of the community and the public in the accountability. Just to finish with a quote, which is a Peelian principle, and Robert Peel was the founding father of the whole police service in the UK. And regardless of what you think of Robert Peel, one of his key principles way back in the 1800s was police at all times should maintain a relationship with the public that gives reality to the tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. Think about that and think about what that should look and feel like when it's brought to life. I often say to the police, and they don't like this statement, I often say, policing does not belong to you. Policing belongs to all of us. And it's an endeavour that we all should be fighting for to ensure that our communities, and especially our most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities, have a stake in. Thank you. Akila, I've probably gone over my 6 minutes. And I apologize for that, but I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
No apologies. I mean, thank you, Debbie, for the profound work that you have done. The work, of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement is known worldwide. I've had the total honor of visiting Ireland, Northern Ireland, in right after the agreement in 2001. And have had opportunity to meet John Hume and talk about the peace treaty that we organized in LA and look at some of the similarities, because there's such a there's so many like kind of similar experiences that we experienced in this country, right, in terms of the conflict. And you named like kind of 3 really important pieces, about attaching investment to reform. This is a conversation we're having here now, right? The political will, to make legislation work, and then also not to look at this thing through the frame, the peace agreement through the frame of law enforcement, and that there has to be independent investigation. I think that those 3 pieces that you laid out resonate, with the strategy that we need to do here in this country. And so I just want to again just thank you for your work. And I know that there'll be many questions. So I want to go ahead and move to Zelda Holtzman to share. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon from my side, but I take it it's good morning or good evening or some other time of the day, somewhere in the world and where we are. I'm really happy and excited to be part of this conversation, but I'm particularly challenged as to where to start with this conversation. As some of you might know, the issue of policing and policing outcomes have always been part of the nature of my work. It's a path that I've traveled with great enthusiasm, but also with great disappointment. And I want to hopefully just bring out why that is. But I want to start with sort of, where do we start this conversation about public safety? There's a tendency, a general orientation, a proclivity to start that with the police because of assumption that the police equals public safety. And then when it doesn't, because there's some breaches of the protocols and we have deaths on the street, then it's referred to by establishment by the police and police aficionados, inevitably elements of the state and the judiciary, as the rotten apple syndrome. It's the rotten apple. Let us have an inquiry. Let us have a commission of inquiry because it's untoward, it's not natural. So when 40 people are mowed down by the police in Marikana and workers are killed, we still call that a rotten apple syndrome when 40 people are dead. If the protesting students are shot at and some person ends up dead on the street, is that also a rotten apple syndrome? And if protesters, communities are protesting, demanding basic services, access to sanitation, water, housing, and the police open fire on them, then we say it's a rotten apple syndrome. But I would put out and assert that it is a rotten system syndrome that we're dealing with. But also that there shouldn't be surprises that the system is rotten. If we go back to the historiography, the history of the system, then a shared history that some of us in our locales, in our countries, in our settings, share as a common denominator, and that is a common colonizer that brought with it instruments of power and control, one of which is the police, whatever its form and its nature or variations thereof. The police was an instrument of control to protect a colonial order and also the profits and the loot of that conquest. So it is an instrument that essentially is geared towards protecting property and people with property, and particularly property that's come by through theft and loot in the process of colonial conquest. So when we look at the period that we had in South Africa, the moment to change that was in the transition period. So maybe just to tell you a bit about myself. So I've experienced policing as in the full circle. I was arrested a number of times. I spent time in solitary confinement, experienced everything that goes with it, and bore the brunt of policing personally, and buried comrades who were killed and tortured by the police. So it's a first-hand relationship of bad policing. At the time, we understood that the type of policing was par for the apartheid extended colonial cause. Then when we had the opportunity to transform systems for a democratic dispensation, we were stuck on the question of policing. Because at that point, we didn't think that the basis, the construct, the DNA of policing need to change. So there was the assumption, if we are integrated, those of us from the liberation movements, and we top up with a few Democrats in the various divisions of the police and also accountability structures, that the right people at the right place, at the right level, would change this instrument of power. And initially, that is how we felt. There was a time in South Africa after 1994 where our communities wanted public order policing and walked arm in arm with the police. There was a time when I was in a leadership position in the police in full uniform. I would walk in gang-ridden areas, gang-infested areas without a firearm. Incidentally, I never wore a firearm and would never have had any fear. And it's that position, I think, that Debbie articulated, when the police and the community have a synergetic relationship around principles and objectives. But when they veer back to the original intent of an instrument of power and control, purposive to that class objective, purposive to protecting property and individuals with property, then the default is armed to the teeth to protect that which you need to protect with the orientation and the resources and the capacity. So it's no wonder when we talk about the area of drugs, for example, then it's the war on drugs. It's the war on. If there is a war, there must be an enemy. And what is common in many of our settings is that in the police, in their DNA, without that deconstructed, put in different uniform, change the shade, change the color, change the symbols, but the orientation hasn't changed fundamentally. We haven't decolonized from the colonial construct. So we expect this instrument to do something which it's not geared to do, and then we are surprised. So coming back to when and how we start this conversation of policing for the people has to have an element of where the people are at in relation to that. And if we start a conversation with what do people need, then we probably might come up with a different answer, and certainly wouldn't be one that would speak to a militarized police armed to the teeth that identify the enemy in the colonial construct that happen to be poor, that happen to be workers, that happen to be Black people, that happen to be all those that are othered, other than those who have property and have privilege. So we're often surprised when there is this, what is referred to as rotten apples. No, it is a system. It's a rotten system that would have that as an outcome, and we'll go from one commission to the next commission looking at why police react in a violent manner when it's a violent instrument turned to what is then considered the enemy. So I think it's important for us to look at how the conversation is framed and what it would take to look at it through different lenses as what the needs of the community would be and what would guarantee and where the guarantors for the needs of safety would be. And I don't think that our default generally is towards reforms, and we change the name and we change the symbols, but fundamentally we don't change the orientation. So unless we deconstruct and decolonize, we probably would have another Marikana, another Floyd, another Tekana, etc., and all we engaging is mobilizing around that incident as if it is outside of a general consequence of the nature of this instrument of violence that we expect to bring about peace, when in fact it is linked to the manifestation of further violence. So just in short, I don't know if I cut any time, if we won any time or lost. I wasn't looking at the watch, but just as a few opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zelda. Such a profound, way in which you frame, policing as an instrument of power and control to protect the colonial order. It's an instrument, to protect property and individuals with property. I mean, it is, I think that Americans we're so like myopic in our view of what's happening, in the world. We think that everything evolves around us and don't really understand like kind of how colonization has impacted, the entire world. And so, just profound work. Thank you so much for what you do. And I want to next introduce Susan Lee.
Hi, thank you so much. I definitely took some time to think about, the things I have learned within working with police reform. And, just like Zelda, I literally do not know where to start. So I did have some bullet points in regards to what I do want to speak on before I go on a tangent, because I can always do that. But again, my name is Susan Lee. I am originally from Lowell, Massachusetts. I have more of experience within the Massachusetts criminal justice and juvenile justice reform. And to answer the question, I believe Akila mentioned what was something I learned doing this work. And, for most of 2020, I learned the importance of community and the mental wellness to do the actual work. That brought me back to a time where we went to myself and a group of my friends went to the protest for George Floyd last summer, and very peaceful, one of the biggest turnouts. And I've been protesting for the last 10 years of my life. So, 2020 just had a different feel in the atmosphere, where the young organizers in charge of, or the creators of Black Boston 2020, at the end of the march, they mentioned, the march has ended and the police will do what the police do, look out for one another. Literally, as that statement was mentioned and we were all making our way home, I looked to my left and saw a police cruiser rush into a crowd of young people trying to go home, witnessing a young man trying to take the subway home, but it was blocked off, and saw a police officer take out their baton and beat on this young man for trying to go home. Witnessed a 15, 16-year-old girl get maced in the face just because she pulled out her phone behind the barracks. I had to walk 5 miles just to get to the closest area to take a bus home, just because a lot of the places were blocked off. But then to go home and see what was shown on the media was the complete opposite of what actually happened. So just from that point on, and now like a year later, going into this space, I think a lot of the community has felt a lot of defeat, seeing Black and brown bodies being killed in broad daylight. Seeing it in our own backyards. I come from a neighborhood that's gang affiliated. We see and hear a lot of things, but it still doesn't desensitize us from witnessing it on social media or on the news. So me being in this role for a little over a year now, regardless of the organizing work that I do have, fighting for police reform means clocking in 9 to 5 and then logging off to still face those same injustices. And all of that has taught me, even though we have our community, we also have to look out for our own mental health to continuously log back on in, as Debbie mentioned, put our foot on the gas so we can keep doing the work. In spite of that, so for the actual police reform that has happened in Massachusetts, it was a long fight where our formal legislative process typically ends, or the bill cycle ends on July 31st. And that's when we thought we would hear some type of victory for police reform in Boston or in Massachusetts. But it was a long fight and we didn't get anything passed until New Year's Eve. A big part of the police reform bill, I believe it was over 170 pages. It covered a wide range of police accountability training, and a big part that UTEC and TLTW, which is Teens Leading the Way, had a part of was expungement for juveniles. About 10 years ago was when expungement was introduced to legislation in regards to fighting for it for young people. We didn't realize there wasn't any law for juveniles to receive expungement for their records. It's just sealing, and expungement was only offered for adults. That was a big wake-up call for me. I was 16 at the time, and knowing that my peers also didn't realize that wasn't an option for them either. So in regards to that, it took about 8 years. So in 2018, the first round of expungement was passed in legislation. And when it comes to victories where we know we should celebrate things like that, because it's so hard to pass a law anywhere at any time, none of the young people who advocated for expungement qualified. And so New Year's Eve of 2020 made it so that it opened up the door a little bit more for young people. But that's, to me, it still wasn't enough. And a lot of our young people, including myself, thankfully, are finding ways to keep the fire going in our passions and not feel defeated. We understand that those small victories, although may not be something we want to see, we know that there's still work to do. It shows us that we can still get movement, and even though it's a marathon, not a race. I also want to be, because I don't know how much time I went or what have you. The transparency of legislators was also something different that I had witnessed over my years of doing advocacy work, where the leaders of the police reform bill let us know openly, the police union are also organizing to stop the reform from happening. Even in our own backyard, Lowell, Massachusetts, the city councilors mentioned, and they took a vote that racism was not a public health issue. Anyone who knows Lowell, Massachusetts, we have refugees from the Khmer Rouge find home in Lowell. We have Irish immigrants. We have a lot of African immigrants. It's a very diverse city. To see people who are supposed to represent us declare that racism was not a public health issue in the middle of a pandemic, where we are spending days and weeks marching in the streets, and to not see that in your own backyard was very disheartening. To then later on have Lowell City Council again vote that they will back the police because they love them, which is fine. But when you love someone, you hold them accountable for their wrongdoings. They voted to also stop the police reform bill from happening from the state. And with that being said, just recently in the past couple of weeks, after understanding that I also learned the police union are great organizers. They definitely, which is also a misconception, because for us to have had a police reform bill, we had to work with police who wanted to see change in their departments as well. That narrative often isn't shown because it's all done behind closed doors. Within the last couple of weeks, the president of the police union we found out publicly that he's a child molester, and to understand that this was a secret kept from many people, and he was elected as president of the police union, is also disheartening for organizers who put hours and hours and hours throughout their days and nights to push this reform, and to see that these secrets are being held. The Boston Police Department were exposed in a documentary called Trial 4 on Netflix. Sean Ellis is a great organizer as well, who's helping and putting back time into the community for, having rights for people who have felonies to have rights to vote as well. So although there's a lot to celebrate in movement, there is still so much work to do. And sometimes, I get overwhelmed, don't know where to start, but then community is helpful to ground yourself and understand that you're not in it by yourself. Ever since the Chauvin trial started, police has killed 64 people. Ever since the verdict, one more was killed. And it comes to a point where what does reform really mean? What does it mean to see change, and what does success look like these days? We talk about good cops and bad cops, but I make the example of, there are no good cops. If there are 270 bad cops and there's 30 good cops who do not speak up for the injustices done by their peers, then we now have 300 bad cops. I don't know what else to say to follow that, but I think it's been a solid 6 minutes. I can also answer any questions in the chat, and I'll look at it briefly as well. But just wanted to summarize, this is what we've been dealing with just the past year alone. We're still, the young people in Massachusetts are still pushing every day to ensure there are justices for young people. Young lives are often disregarded, and that's why I do the push to ensure young people are seen and heard, and bringing power to the people, bringing them to spaces that they are not originally invited to.
Thank you so much, Susan. And, thank you for the great work that you're doing. It's like, that next generation of activism is so important. And as you said, and as Debbie said, it's like we have to keep our feet on the gas. We can't let up, because even though, Chauvin was prosecuted, yesterday, and it's, as you said, 64 people died during the trial, at the hands of police, and then one right after. And especially in contrast to what Debbie shared about 20 years, there's been one police involved shooting. I mean, that is like mind-boggling in terms of, thinking about, policing in the US, right? That it's important, one of the things that you shared about reform, that reform is not just procedural justice and more, de-escalation trainings for the police. It's also about investing in complementary strategies like the work that you're doing, that engages impacted people in the work, because, you can't have public safety without the public. And that police are not the totality of the public safety process. Public safety does not equal police, and I think that this has been a consistent theme across the board with each one of our speakers. And so now we want to invite, all of you to participate in this conversation and bring some questions to us, right? And I'm kind of, scrolling through, some of the questions and everything that have been presented. And Mara, Wayne, you wanna go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. I wanted to just thank all of the presenters for your varying perspectives and all of your important work. I was wondering if you could comment about the importance of the role of mental health and the overlap with the mental health system, especially in the United States being a broken system, the overlap with systemic racism, and how you see that as playing a role in any of the work that you've done. And I can give an example. In Philadelphia, at the end of October, a 27-year-old, I believe, Black male, Walter Wallace Jr., his family called the police, and he had a known history of mental illness and was connected with a community mental health center. And police responded, and he was shot and killed at the end of October. And the conversation that has been ongoing is about getting mobile crisis response to play more of a role, to be diverting from police response, and for police to be having training in de-escalation, which in mental health would be universal training. In Philadelphia, in the police academy, previously there had been training on first aid for mental health, and that funding went away, and that's no longer in place. But people who are on the police force and have been there for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, they do get a training. So I think that's another piece too. Where are you doing the training, and kind of if you can train early and have that be a part of the work, that you can have a better impact, hopefully. So interested to hear any of your thoughts. Thanks.
I can kind of speak to that. Thank you so much for sharing. So a big part of police reform, and a lot of people, talk about mental health a lot, especially being in a career that your life is at risk also. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I hope I'm not misrepresenting UTech right now, but we do a lot of work behind the walls. So meaning we do meet our young people, in jail, and do work with them there as well to help transition them out and into our programs. One of the things that we wanted to pilot, and if I'm not mistaken, we have tried this with our local law enforcement, is having a mental health counselor aid the police officer to any type of de-escalation or mental health calls, where if someone's having a breakdown, mental breakdown, or anything of that sort, having a counselor there to aid the police officer. Even though police are trained in de-escalation, when it comes to mental health and recognizing behaviors, I believe that is the gray area that isn't all the way there just yet. I can be wrong, but I believe we did try piloting that and ensuring that the counselors are de-escalating, or at least analyzing the situation before a law enforcement comes in and takes over. That's something that a lot of organizers in Massachusetts and across the country are advocating for. Especially for examples in Philadelphia, or even one of our young people that I worked with directly and went to high school with, would have prevented an arrest in a hospital if a counselor had came to respond to the call versus a police officer. And we see that a lot in schools. We actually advocated to remove police completely from schools, high schools, and the school to prison pipeline, and trying to address that as well. But of course, there's a lot of pushback on that, and we're trying to find a compromise to ensure that, you know, young people or anyone with mental health needs are met.
Thank you, Suzanne. I want to call on Alicia Parker to ask her question.
Thank you, Akila. I just wanted to ask Zelda. I was in South Africa with Nadine, and we went with Mayor Dinkins, and I saw that a lot of the Black police officers there had really bought into the mindset, you know, that they were doing the right thing when in keeping Black people marginalized. And I was wondering, how difficult was it to change, and if you did change the mindset of Black police officers to stop seeing their own people as the enemy?
I think that's at the heart of it, if I might. Sorry, Akila, is it okay for me to respond?
Yes, please.
I think that's at the heart of it, because we went with a very naive assumption, still in the glory days of the Mandela period, that when you have the good people and right people in the right position, that you'll have the right outcomes. So what was the good and the right people in a system, a police structure that consisted of 98% white men of a particular religious orientation and a racist mindset, with the enemy being Black people, and particularly poor Black marginalized people, but any protesting, any Black person contesting power, right? Because that is what they are. So we had the opportunity to change that, and we sprinkled a few Black people in, like I don't know if you've seen, or maybe just recall an image of a pack of peanuts with a few raisins. And there's more raisins and a few peanuts. So you sprinkle a few peanuts and you expect to have this sort of automatic reorientation because you've got a few right people. And we had good people at the time who could hold that space. In South Africa, for example, the head of the Secretariat, Azar Kachalia, who today is a judge, was a committed human rights activist. So we had faith that that space of accountability and policy reformulation, etc., is in safe hands. And we had a few people, some of us spread across the organization, with the assumption that a few good, right people would hold that space and things would transform. In reality, it doesn't work that way, because good people die, good people leave. But what about the system at its core retains and maintains and presents the possibility of reproducing itself at the least opportunity? And that is what happens. And that is what happened. So hence the question of what needs to go beyond. And I think it's a challenging one, because the pushback against the possibility of an alternative, or reimagining an alternative system for safety and self-ordering and peacekeeping, etc., is countered by high crime rates, violent crime, and especially those conditions that lend itself to a period of opening up. And we've seen that in most post-conflict situations where the high crime rate justifies the security mechanisms. And that in South Africa wasn't immune, and certainly wasn't unique in that instance. But again, I think part of that is, if we are to re-look at that moment, what would we be saying to the actors in that period? And I would think part of that is to support the on-the-ground, community-orientated resources for community peace, where the state plays a resourcing role and a supporting role. However, our assumption that good people would have good outcomes, as if that would hold forever, then had a reliance on the state, that as a default, if the state is orientated to protecting privilege, you're going to have the instruments of the state protecting privilege. So it really reflects the nature of the state. And a democratic state such as ours, is in a fledgling democracy, has that fragility to go either way at the point of crisis. However, I do think that on a global level, we are in a crisis. There's not a crisis of crime, there's a policing crisis. There's a crisis of the state. And this moment presents itself nearly as a stretched moment to rethink those possibilities and the reinforcement of the possibilities to stay the course for a community-orientated peace and safety mechanism rather than a reliance on the state, which have that contradiction inherent within itself if it is not fundamentally orientated to a state that holds not only values, but in practice, that for the poor and the marginalized, etc., and the instrument to tip the balance in favor of those who need protection more. So unless we guarantee that that is the orientation, our fallback will have to be what is required to engender a community resource as a counterbalance to the power we're up against all the time. And I think it's a conversation, we don't have ready-made answers, but it is a deep conversation that is necessary for this rethinking and the reimagining. And I would think that it's not an either or, it's not reform versus total transformation or non-police. It is what about that can be orientated towards a community resource to hold the peace. And incidentally, I think in most settings, the one thing that will come up against when you argue for either defunding the police or abolishing the police would be, but what about gender-based violence? It's a runaway trade, as if the police is orientated to stemming the tide of gender-based violence. Yet that gets used. And then we just basically succumb to that because we're not answering the question as to what is the alternative to the police, because we're not asking the right question as to who holds the peace. So then we get tied in knots because we assume the police can and should, and therefore if we change a few things, then they will. But we've seen in practice that is, I think it's a stretch moment of an opportunity and a possibility to rethink social ordering in a context of social justice and democracy.
Thank you so much, Zelda. I know Debbie wanted to respond to the last question, and then I'm going to go to Eleanor Sisulu, and then to Jim Isaac, and then Martin O'Brien. Debbie?
Yeah, thanks, Akila. On Maura's question around mental health, I just wanted to say, in this jurisdiction, and I don't know if it's the same where you are, but 70% of calls to the police are not about criminality. Only about 30% of our calls to the police are to do with criminal issues. The other 70% are around vulnerability, around mental health, and people feel they've nowhere else to go. So it's back to Susan's point around getting the right mechanisms in place that are public health structures that really allow people in socially disadvantaged communities to go elsewhere. So if people are experiencing issues, one, in our community, some of them will not call the police because they're either afraid to, because that will send out a message: if the police land at your door, what will the rest of the community think about that? Number two, if they are willing to call the police, normally it's not a policing issue. And so that brings around a whole other range of issues. The police aren't the people to deal with that. And a lot of the time they recognize that. So we now have a pilot in Belfast where psychiatric nurses are in custody suites with the police, because the police hand over to them and say, this isn't a policing issue, this is a welfare issue, and can you deal with that? That's only in its infancy, but that's been very difficult for the police, because the police here think they need to solve all of the problems. And actually, if the right structure's in place, it lets them off the hook, and it lets them be out of that space where they need to de-escalate. The other thing that I wanted to say was around the community-oriented services. There still is an attitude and a culture here that the professionals know best. Who are the professionals?
Right.
The professionals are people in the community that are living this and experience it every day. So it's back to that issue around sharing of power. Where should the power rest? The power should rest with the people who are experiencing the problems, actually know what the solution should be, but just don't have the resource, or the political structures to make that work. So it really is back to that issue about community-oriented solutions, and we need to trust people to come up with those and devise them on their own. Thank you, Akila.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Eleanor Sisulu?
Thank you very much. And thanks to Global Citizens, it's good to see so many good friends here for organizing this. It really spoke directly to what has been troubling me as I've been watching the whole drama of the Derek Chauvin murder trial. And I rejoiced when the verdict came last night, but couldn't stop thinking about how in our countries, policing is such a scourge. And I think Zelda made such an excellent presentation summarizing and summary of policing in South Africa. My other country is Zimbabwe, the place of my birth, where there's not even a discussion about police. It's taken as a given that a policeman can stand on your head. It's not even questioned. And while I would say in the US, racism is really undergirds much of police brutality, in our countries, it's apathy, middle class apathy, and whether some of that is informed by racism, and some of them that is just informed by class selfishness. We did have a moment in South Africa under the Mandela government when Charles Ngakula, who was Minister of Safety and Security, I think it was, intentionally tried to change the police culture. And needless to say, he didn't succeed. And it's very, very difficult to change a culture. You deal with the issue of the policing itself and the laws and it was so impressive, the statement about from Northern Ireland. But I think to actually change a culture, you need much more. I mean, there's things like the violent television police series that we grew up with. And you think if a young person grows up watching those things about the way police conduct themselves, where human beings are either bad or good, there's no complexity of character in those things. What kind of police will they be when they decide to join the police force? They think it's drama, they think it's Rizzoli and Isles or whatever these detective things. So I think the arts and culture community has a big role to play. The culture of language, and I'm glad Zelda pointed out war. It's always a war on drugs, a war on COVID, a war on AIDS. And when the war on COVID was declared, a young man was killed in Alexandra simply because he was drunk in his own yard. And he was killed as part of this war on COVID. So I think it's just really, as part of this, I think artists and the issue of language plays a really important role. And actually envisioning alternatives. And I'm glad there's this cross-national discussion. And I suppose one thing that COVID has given us, that it has forced us onto these platforms, and there's uptake by many, many people. So for civil society activists, it's much easier to engage internationally. And I think it's an opportunity that I'm glad has been grasped and we can have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to give a time check. We have about another 7 minutes, and before we'll wrap the question and answer period. So I'd like to call on Jim Isaac and then Martin O'Brien for our last question. And yes, Jim.
I'll keep it real short here. My main concern, and it's back to language again. In the United States, I think we don't have a good grasp of the distinction between caste and class and poverty and some of the other elements that float through. Some of our international participants, I think, have much more experience with these. And in many ways, I think we tend to refuse that these things like caste might actually exist in the United States and play a role in how we view different communities, how we isolate them, and then how we deal with public safety in those areas, or public service in those areas. So I'd love to hear any feedback from the international people, especially.
Debbie or Zelda?
Sorry, would I have to ask you to repeat the question? I couldn't, that was very faint, sorry.
Sorry, basically, in the US, we pretend we don't have class or caste. But I think in other countries, you recognize the reality of that. So my question really is, how diluted are we here?
Could you read the question okay?
Akila, sorry, just help me here because I'm having difficulty with the noise. Just repeat the question for me. Sorry, I don't want to.
Yeah, so he was saying that, there's in other countries, there's this, class or caste like kind of system that exists. And in the US, he believes that maybe the class and caste system underscores a lot of what happens here. Are we like delusional in this country, right, about whether or not it exists like as a system and contributes to some of, what we see happening in terms of, police violence?
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think it's an important question, and it comes back to the initial framing. What is this animal called the police, and what are they supposed to do? And when we see them not doing, how do we respond to it? So, and our responses tend to be piecemeal because we expect one thing, yet they're orientated to do exactly what they're doing. In fact, I would question even the term extrajudicial killings. It's judicial sanctioned killings when the police shoot out because social experiment, take a few young people, put them in military uniform, give them an R1 or whatever sort of automatic rifles, whatever the US police and other armed police are issued with. Put them in the uniform, give them a rank, and put them in information. They operate like a killing machine. They're not going to be orientated, never mind that human rights, civil rights training to relate to people on a human level, because that dehumanizes that uniform and the weaponry is, and to then have or the exercise of that intention as a target. They might call it different suspect, whatever, but it's a target, and the target has a color, the target has a class, and it's particularly prevalent and obvious in an unequal society. And where the inequality manifests, there the resource is put to bear to protect that which is privileged in this unequal relationship. In South Africa, you have Black people from poor communities, informal settlements, who are police officers, but you would find that information with their guns at the ready. How does it explain that in human nature? It doesn't make sense. It's illogical, but the logic lies in the system. So whether you have a stated class orientation or segregation or stratification, a economic class stratification, a social class, a racial class stratification, who would the police protect if their orientation is protecting power and privileges? Those most privileged and those who hold the power. So the setting might be nuanced by that stratification, but in an unequal society, the police takes an option for those who pay their salary and the orientation of those who are the masters of the bank, who holds the purse strings. So unless you have a counterbalance of a community that is empowered and engendered to hold the institution and the instrument accountable and to change that instrument of power to suit and to respond to its needs, you're constantly going to contest in that space of inequality.
Thank you so much, Zelda. And for our final question, we had so many great questions, and I just apologize that we couldn't get to them all. But I see there's a great chat, conversation going on in the chat as well. But I'd like to call on Martin O'Brien to ask our final question.
Thanks, Akila. I suppose I was just going to ask Debbie and Zelda, as people who've been involved in the effort to transform policing and who've seen, progress made, but also very significant rollback, is there something in particular that you think we have to watch out for? I mean, I think you know, Debbie, you've already said you mustn't take your foot off, we mustn't take our foot off the gas. You can never really stop. And, you know, as Ines McCormick, a friend of mine, used to say, power regroups. And Zelda, I think you kind of alluded to the frame maybe being wrong. So I'm just wondering if there's like one thought of advice about rollback and about why actually getting sort of sustainable change at this is so difficult.
Can I? Yeah. May I?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, go on ahead.
Maybe not an answer, but maybe a heading for a follow-up conversation. Sorry, and maybe that is what is the value, or rather, how can we elevate and expand the value of restorative and social justice manifest in our communities that could transform the institutions of the state? So how can we turn the conversation on its head? Now, in South Africa, there's been an experience of community systems, mechanisms for conflict dispute resolution, restorative justice, etc. But it's seen as sort of the stepchild of the criminal justice system. So that's what other people do. How do we mainstream that? What is the potential and the possibility, even in a way that is transformative to the state? So whilst we lost a moment, I think we can regain that by revisiting community agency for power. And I think in that lies possibilities. And I'm saying that with caution, because if you reimagine a world without the police, considering that there was a world before police, right? The pre-colonial world, if we may. So the argument is that things have moved to the extent that that we can't imagine a world without the police. Of course, because the conditions have changed. But how do we imagine a world of a world maybe with a different type of police? And what would that be? And where would and who would and how would that come about? What are the elements and what are the hooks? And I think historically we have hooks that we could latch onto, a main framing of whether it's a people's power, a people's resource, a sort of reimagining that goes back to the essence of community, and then sort of link the hooks on that, whether it's welfare, mental health care, education systems, etc. But when all of that is removed from the community and it is in the realm of the state, then we're beholden to and we're subjected to and we're at the mercy of the powers that be. And I think more than changing the conversation, we need to change the practice. And I would say probably just finally on that, we must reclaim the space, we must reclaim the power of community to give effect to our order, our social order and our social justice, and to hold that within the bounds of community and bring other resources, including the state, private sector, ever to account to that level, rather than the conversation says, hold them to account. To what? Right. They need to come to account to that level where their services are needed and should be orientated towards. I think it's sort of a number of conversations that we need to have, but the intersect is what and who holds the peace, and how do we sustain and how do we maintain it, and the extent to which the police or education system or health services are aligned to those conditions and the orientation of what is needed. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Zelda. Debbie?
Yeah. I'm not going to repeat what Zelda has said, but as a restorative practitioner, I feel very strongly that in this jurisdiction, we're working towards organizations and systems becoming more restorative. So what would a restorative police service look like? And people, Zelda is right, people are almost afraid to go there, but we need to be transformative in the lens through which we see this. And it's not enough just to tinker around the edges. And our reform program has done more than tinker around the edges. But to answer Martin's question, and to be really pragmatic, because I tend to be quite pragmatic in my approach, I think some of the learning from what we've done and why we've had a bit of a rollback are the following. So our reform program didn't mention legacy once. So our newly reformed police service hadn't a remit initially around legacy. The thinking was that our politicians would take care of that, and our politicians could not find a way to navigate their way through legacy. So in looking and in thinking about policing in the US and in other places, you cannot do reform looking at the present and the future without addressing the past. So people who have experienced police violence in the past, families, people who've been shot dead, injustices around that, you cannot leave that unattended. That has to be dealt with, because part of why we've had rollback now is unless that is attended to, the poison of the past continues to seep through in the present. It just cannot go away. It will not disappear. People think that drawing a line under it, closing your eyes and pretending it isn't there, that does not work. So part of why we've had a bit of a rollback currently is because people are continued to be haunted by the past. So you need to attend to that, number one. Number two, in our wisdom, we thought police are retiring very, very quickly and in huge numbers here. So what we need to do is rush people through our training colleges. Wrong. So we now have police officers who go through training only for 21 weeks, and then they're out on the streets carrying guns. That's not good enough, because in 21 weeks, you cannot teach a change in culture. You cannot teach human rights, policing with the community, vulnerability, victim-centered, community-oriented. You cannot do all of that in 21 weeks. So you need to hold your police services to account for how they do training, and you need to be a part of the training. Community always needs to be front and center in police training. I think that's the second thing. And the third thing is a change in leadership. So if you get a change in leadership and you think this is a good change in leadership, we'll trust this. Don't trust your instincts. Never take your foot off the pedal. Still keep human rights front and center. Still keep policing with the community front and center, because regardless of their narrative, they need to be held to account underneath the surface. So one of the things that we had here, we had a change in leadership around the chief of police. And we also had a change in leadership around the police and accountability mechanism. 9 whole new members came on board, and they were quite, I'll say this in the public sphere, to me, they don't set me on fire, and they're not connected into community. So if the people on your accountability body don't set you on fire, it's our responsibility to put a fire under them. So lobby them, advocate them, knock their doors down, be a thorn in their side, and set them on fire with not letting them off the hook. So Martin, to answer your questions in terms of a rollback, I think we had a culmination of a number of factors that came to a head all at once. And I think we now know we were maybe a tad complacent, and we need to roll back from our complacency and set the world alight again in terms of police accountability, policing reform, and communities being at the center of how we do business.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And I want to thank all of our speakers, Debbie Waters, Zelda Holtzman, and Susan Lee, for your great contributions to this really profound conversation. And just to quickly summarize and pass it back to my colleagues, safety is a fundamental right, you know, and it's important that we put public safety in public hands, right? That race plays a very important role, you know, in what we've seen as misconduct and brutality, and that reform, it's not just about investing in more procedural justice training and the de-escalation strategies for law enforcement, but it's also about investing in complementary strategies that are led by impacted people in community. And that when we talk about reform, we must invest in the change. It's not just a conversation. That we have to have the political will, right? As Debbie said, in order to make these things happen. And that we can never take our foot off the gas, because we look away for one moment and power is reorganizing itself, to maintain its position. And so thank you all so much for such a lively conversation. And I want to turn it over to Theo.
Thank you so much, Akila. I just want to thank everyone, Debbie, Zelda, Susan, and Akila. I also want to thank our hosts this morning, Tito Jackson, co-chair of chair of Global Citizens Circle, and Martin O'Brien, director of the Social Change Initiative. Of course, I also would be remiss if I did not thank Phoebe Delarabidi, who is the assistant director for Global Citizens Circle, and for whom we owe so much for organizing and helping to make these circles happen in this virtual setting. So thank you to all of you, but thank you most to all of you who've joined us today and who've listened and learned and taken part in the discussion. And it's a discussion that will continue, and it needs to lead to action for building the safe and just communities that we all want and deserve. I want to invite those of you who would like to stay. We're not going anywhere. If you need to leave, of course, we understand. We've been on for an hour and a half now, but as we usually do for the ends of circles, invite any of you who'd like to stay and continue the conversation now. We welcome that. But thank you all for being here, for being in the conversation, for putting so many important points and resources in the chat. We will get that out to everybody, and so that you can all continue the conversation and the actions that you're taking in your places in the world. So thank you very much, and be safe, be well, and onward with optimism.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to very great, wonderful chairing and seeing all of you. And I think I'm looking forward to a follow-up on conversations and maybe some of the thematic areas drawn out of this. Yes, I'm really looking forward to that. Unfortunately, I would have to skedaddle, but any follow-up, raise my hand. I'm there for that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Zelda.
Thanks, Zelda.
Thanks, Zelda.
Theo, could you speak, Theo, about our next circle as just a little information tying in with the restorative?
Yes, so I will mention that we are planning, we don't have the date set, but we are planning to do a circle in June on trauma. And of course, that relates to so much of what we've been talking about this entire year, from the time that we started doing our virtual programs focused on first COVID-19, the pandemic, and then the killing of George Floyd, continuing with conversations throughout the summer and fall. So in June, which is the end of our program season, the culminating program will focus on healing from societal trauma. And so we hope you'll all join us in June. We'll get this information out to you as soon as we have things confirmed. But yeah, that's our plan. So again, feel free if anybody has a question, just want to stay on and chit chat, that's fine. If you need to go, feel free to sign off. So I see people are signing off right as we speak.
I'd love
Thank
to
you.
Phoebe.
Hi.
Some of your thoughts, Phoebe, having seen this in completion now.
I think I'm just taking it all in. It was unknown where it would lead to today because of yesterday's events. And I've just been really touched again by the community that we draw together and the way it informs really, really a global conversation, and that we kept that perspective throughout. So I feel I'm processing a lot of what was shared, and so touched to see past participants and people that have been discussion leaders on the call. You know, it really feels like we've built a global community over this last year. And I was very touched that Eleanor Sisulu's comments came in. And I'm excited that we might be able to touch more on some restorative practices for our next conversation, because I think we kind of reached that point by the end where we know it's a long way to go, but I think that that is a conversation that we need to have. Yeah.
Thank
Phoebe, can I just want to mention that I asked Zelda the question about the difficulty in changing the mindset of Black police officers in South Africa, because we have the same difficulty here in the United States, where there are a lot of Black police officers that see, minority communities as the enemy, as the enemy, people who live in minority communities as the enemy. And I was just wondering how they, or if they were able to turn that around, that maybe there was something that we could do here.
And it's a shame, I don't know if Tony's still here. I think he might be, and if he'd be willing to speak, but we've spoken more informally about the collective trauma and the traumatization of young people that then go into the police. And I think there's a lot of discussion now around ancestral inheritance when it comes to trauma as well. So I don't know, Tony, whether you would want to speak to that, or if there's anyone else here who might.
I'm here. I'm here and listening. Yeah, no, it's in my own journey. Once I really understood the role of toxic shame and how it manifested in my own life, I was able to recognize how it manifested in the lives of other people. And as I started to look at what other people were struggling with through the lens of trauma and shame, I looked at what other types of shame are there, and asked the question: Is there a collective toxic shame? That toxic shame with the feeling of being less than, is the experiences of the group can create that through group trauma, that toxic shame, which if it's not dealt with, it spills itself out in dysfunction all over the place. And looking at other communities and the historical trauma, knowing that toxic shame cascades generation to generation and until it's healed. And I think absolutely that manifests itself in all kinds of ways, even the subconscious self-loathing. And so absolutely I could see the historical trauma, even generations ago, the continuing reinforcing of that trauma, and that toxic shame output of the trauma cascading generation to generation to generation in group. And the crazy thing is the group trauma then manifests itself in individual traumas and victimizations of family members and all kinds of things. And the analogy I used, it's for African Americans, where the community seems to be really struggling and drowning, and it's how do we get them out of the water and help them, and we got to take the hand off the face that's pushing them down. But if we don't deal with the anchor of trauma that's chained to their leg, pulling them down, taking the hand off the face isn't enough. And so we have to look at the below the surface, what's happening in that cycle of trauma that is pulling down as much as the hand of oppression is pushing down. Not enough to remove the hand of oppression. We have to heal that anchor of trauma as well.
Thank you, Tony.
And I don't want to put Susan on the spot, but I know Susie's here and she's an expert in restorative practice. I don't know if you're willing to say a few words, Susie. Maybe.
She might have stepped away.
She might have stepped away.
Just on Alicia's point, I mean, I think the thing that the change efforts here, and I think the South African one bears out as well, is just the power of the cultures in these institutions and how cultural messages and behaviors are transmitted in a way that kind of subverts a lot of the efforts that have been made to actually develop different cultures. And so I think we all underestimate the power of those. And that leads to the kind of, if you like, the vigorousness of the ideas that you would expect, people, I mean, we've had a problem here where in the Northern Ireland context where you had very historic, significant levels of underrepresentation of Catholics in the police, and then very significant progress made to actually change that. So you move from 8% to maybe 30%, quite a big change. But then you see problems with retention because the culture within it isn't sufficiently kind of hospitable for people to stay. And so you then begin to understand the kind of multifaceted nature of the problem, I guess. So I think if Zelda was here, the answer to your question would be they didn't find ways to do that. That is, I think, a salutary lesson to us because there were really quite significant gains made in South Africa in the transition process around policing that have kind of what you heard Eleanor describe it as the scourge of policing, Eleanor Sisulu. So yeah, we've our work cut out for us, but doesn't mean we should. What was the quote that Tito started with? We can't abandon the task.
Exactly. Yeah, we all have a lot of work to do, and I'm gonna try to go back in the chat here and see if I can actually find that quote because it I don't know if I have it down.
I have it here.
You?
I
want to read that, but just one moment though, Martin. I want to give anybody else a chance to say anything, make a comment or ask a question or just chat. But then we'll close and it might be a good way to close things out with reading of that quote that Tito began with from the rabbi. Anybody else just before we hear that again?
Chris, you need to unmute.
Chris? There you are.
Hello, Chris from Maine. I just wanted to say hello to all the Dunphy cousins. And ironically, as this conversation has gone forward, I have an appointment with our chief of police to talk about the gun issues here in Maine and our community. But it's just so inspiring. And even though we're a very small community, it's a great start. And with the open doors that we already have, hopefully we'll move forward. So thank you all, and good to see you all.
Thank you, Chris. Martin, the floor is yours.
Okay. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everybody.